Hey everybody, this is Grace Segers with the New Republic. I believe we are going to be starting the panel as soon as our panelists are made panelists. It's been 5 years since COVID, but like Zoom is still Zoom. We're always figuring it out. Uh, just bear with us as we figure out some of these technical difficulties. We will be starting in a few minutes. I am oops, I have too many tabs open, but I'm very excited for this conversation. I think it's going to be a really good one. So just give us a couple more minutes as we figure out this whole Zoom situation. I think we have almost all of our panelists. We are waiting on one more. And I will just keep vamping as I was born to do. Uh, yeah,
Grace, I know I'm still having to remember to click unmute when I want to speak on a Zoom
right.
5 years in. So we are all there.
Hey, okay. I think we have everybody, all of our panelists. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited for this. Again, for those who are just joining us, I'm Grace Segers. I'm a staff writer here at the New Republic. We are being joined today by three really amazing guests for our panel discussion on women in politics. I do have a bit of a spiel here before we can get to the good stuff. So panelists, viewers, please bear with me. We have to start with our introductions. We have Congresswoman Sarah McBride here. She represents the great state of Delaware in the House of Representatives. Previously, she served as state senator for the 1st State Senate District, where she passed legislation expanding access to healthcare, requiring mental health and media literacy education in public schools, promoting green technologies, and protecting workers and families. She also previously worked for former Governor Jack Markell and the late Attorney General Beau Biden and served as the national spokesperson for the Human Rights Campaign. Sarah, thank you so much for being here. Really excited to have you.
Thank you for having me.
We also have here Skye Perryman. She is president and CEO of Democracy Forward, a nonpartisan national legal organization that promotes democracy and progress through litigation, regulatory engagement, policy education, and research. In 2024, she was named one of the most influential people shaping policy by Washingtonian Magazine, and previously served as chief legal officer and general counsel of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Skye, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Great to see you.
Last, certainly not least, we have Minnie Timmaraju. She is the president and CEO of Reproductive Freedom for All and the first woman of color and immigrant to helm the organization. She has more than 25 years of experience leading efforts to advance reproductive rights, gender justice, and racial justice. Minnie was a key campaign surrogate in the 2024 campaign and spoke at the Democratic National Convention. Minnie, as always, is great to see you. So glad to have you here with us.
Good to see you, Grace.
So one final thing, I expect this to be a really wide-ranging conversation touching on the role of women in politics and what to expect under the second Trump administration. But I'm a firm believer that when we talk about women's issues, it's important to remember that all issues are women's issues, and all so-called women's issues are relevant to everyone regardless of gender identity. As such, what we're really going to do is be talking about the important news of the day because we have three major political players on the call today, and I have to take advantage of their expertise as a reporter. And final logistical note, the last 15 minutes or so of this panel will be dedicated to an audience Q&A. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I will select which questions to ask our panelists. Okay, breathe. So now, as I get my tabs here open for my questions, I want to start with one of the biggest news items from last week. We saw Congress approve a continuing resolution for keeping the government open through the end of September. Pretty much every Democrat in the House voted against this bill, but several Democrats in the Senate allowed it to be approved. So, Sarah, I want to start with you on this issue. Do you think this speaks to any dissonance between Democrats about how to handle the Trump administration and the politics that we're seeing right now?
Well, first off, thanks so much, Grace, for those great introductions and for setting the stage for a conversation I've been looking forward to for a while now. So it's great to be on with Skye and Minnie and everyone who's joining us in all of the different modes that they are joining us. Look, the stakes are incredibly high in this moment. And with the stakes as high as they are, with the flood the zone strategy that we are seeing from the administration, there's certainly going to be diversity of thought and diversity of approach and tactics and strategy in a coalition as big and as broad as the Democratic Party. Having said that, for me, the decision around my vote on the continuing resolution was fairly straightforward. This was not a clean CR. This was not a proposal that guaranteed that funding at the levels of last year would continue. One, because of the actual text of the continuing resolution included cuts to veterans benefits, to folks at the IRS who are guaranteeing that billionaires are paying their fair share and not skirting federal tax law. We saw cuts to Head Start. We saw cuts to programs that fund cancer research. There were real and meaningful, tangible cuts, including in the continuing resolution. And then on top of that, because of the nature of the continuing resolution and the lack of language to the contrary, and because of statements by Republican members of Congress and administration officials, we know that it was a blank check for DOJ's efforts to decimate the federal government unilaterally. I felt uncomfortable voting for a proposal, a continuing resolution like that, given the circumstances that we are in. Now, I was not party to the conversations in the Senate caucus. Obviously, House Democrats were 99.9% united essentially on this continuing resolution. And I recognize that when the stakes are this high and an administration is engaging in, at least in modern history, unprecedented abuses of power and clearly a complete unwillingness to abide by the guardrails that we have in federal law or just the norms of our society, that when you're playing with fire, it does create significant stakes no matter what path you go down. I've been fairly conservative when it comes to the fights that we should pick as a party. I think we should be focused. I think we should be strategic, and I think we should be smart. But I do think we should fight in the right moments. And this was a moment where we had clear leverage, a clear lever to push back on this administration. We had a moment to stand our ground and say we will not vote for something not only that gives a blank check to the administration, but also didn't include our voices when our votes were needed. And I think that sets a bad precedent. Like, I think when the stakes are this high, it's easy to go, if there is a risk of something bad happening because of this decision that I make, then I should not make that decision. And you sort of fall into an intellectually justified state of inertia and passiveness. I think we have to guard against being so strategic that we end up not meeting the moment. And I think, unfortunately, the passage of the continuing resolution didn't meet the moment, didn't meet the stakes, and set a dangerous precedent that undermines our capacity to push back and negotiate moving forward.
So I'm going to come back to you about this sort of question of leverage. So put a pin in that thought. But I have to get to our other panelists as well for some questions about things that are happening in this moment. So Minnie, I know you just got back from Wisconsin, where there is a state Supreme Court election on April 1st, and you have been very active in campaigning for Susan Crawford, who is one of the candidates. This very much feels like deja vu from the critical state Supreme Court election in Wisconsin in 2023. As in that election, this contest is attracting a lot of outside campaign spending, and abortion is another key issue here, as cases related to abortion may be brought before the court in the near future. So in 2023, we saw abortion rights supporters were able to help propel Janet Protasiewicz to victory. Do you think that abortion rights are going to be as convincing for voters to turn in Wisconsin to turn out this time around?
Thanks for asking, Grace, and thanks for having me. And it's great to be with my good friends, Representative McBride and Skye Perryman, who we frankly do a lot of work with, and I'm really proud of that work. Here's what I'll say about abortion rights, Wisconsin, all of the money being dumped into the state. Wisconsinites know how to do this. They know how to win tough elections. They've got a well-oiled machine. Abortion rights continue to be incredibly popular. It continues to be salient, as the court right now has before it a case about overturning a ban right now that has affected millions of Wisconsinites and their access to care. So they understand the issue. They understand the stakes. But what's hard to understand is why Elon Musk just dumped $12 million into that race through a single donor run PAC into the state. And there's no precedent for that in a state like Wisconsin. It's quite terrifying. I will say I did multiple events throughout the day, throughout the state, with our local organizers and allies on the ground. The energy is high. Folks are fired up. We were on the campus of University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Susan Crawford spoke to a packed group of young people, most of whom have already early voted, had a voting plan, and were pushing and pulling their colleagues on campus to early vote before spring break. The energy is there. The numbers and the data show that this race is neck and neck. Brad Schimmel, her opponent, has been on the record publicly stating that he supports a total ban on abortion, that the easiest road to an abortion ban would be electing Brad Schimmel. The Right to Life organizations on the ground are being absolutely not discreet about their agenda. Whereas Susan Crawford is an established jurist who's very, frankly, reminds me, honestly, Sarah, a lot of you. She's very much about following the law, understanding the precedent, respecting institutions. I think there's a larger question that I have, though. In an ordinarily world, Grace, this would be no question. You've got an extremist who's out of touch, and you've got somebody who's well known to the community, well known to the people, and has a very fair and balanced record. But these are not ordinary times. We have one of the world's richest man taking a personal interest in the state and dumping a crazy amount of money that is really hard to gauge how it would affect a race like this. So if it were up completely to the people, I'd say we are absolutely winning this race. I am not convinced anymore that that is what's happening, and it is quite terrifying to me to see the impact of this kind of money and influence in a local race like this.
As a quick follow-up to that, do you think that this kind of outside investment is the new normal for state Supreme Court elections, particularly in high-profile states, and particularly when issues like abortion on the line?
I really hope not, but I don't think that this is motivated by abortion. Whereas where Elon Musk and Donald Trump are 100% on the side of the right-wing extremists, I don't know that that's his motivation for putting $12 million as much as it is about shoring up right-wing extremist power and control across the country. That's not to say that that's not Brad Schimmel's motivation, and that's not what the activist motivation is. But I'm trying to make a distinction that I don't think we're just going to see this in statewide races that impact reproductive freedom. I think we're going to see this more and more. And honestly, Skye's the expert here, where you have outside donors and influence who are trying to exert influence on courts to really manipulate what should be an equitable and case law based decision making process and for courts, right? So we've also heard that Elon Musk has other business in front of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. We've also heard rumors about other ways that they're trying to capture control of the court to manipulate decisions on other business outcomes. And I think that is something we should be terrified about. And we're seeing it in real time with an administration that is not interested in actually following court ordered, decisions. So I think, look, when you have unlimited, unfettered dark money, it's an open question about how else could you use that to influence elections where you have judicial bodies like state Supreme Courts that are largely elected. So not a straight answer. I think it's something we have to be extremely cautious about, and we have to be vigilant about watching, and we have to be ready to scream and yell and organize and be in the streets about it because they are trying to capture our courts, and they have been for quite some time.
This is a good segue for my questions for Skye here. Democracy Forward has been, or Protect Democracy has been on the front lines for some of the key litigation challenging Trump administration actions, so including the suit to block the president from removing immigrants from the United States using the Alien Enemies Act. So we've seen the Trump administration push back pretty heavily against the judge in that case, although not necessarily to a point of absolute defiance. If we do get to a point where the Trump administration is refusing to follow court orders, are legal means sufficient for fighting back against executive actions? And what other recourse do you and an organization like yours have?
Well, thank you for having me. And again, it's great to be with this group. Let me just let's start with kind of the lead here. The lead is that the courts right now are the front line in the way we are checking extremism that is harmful to people and communities, that is extremism that is offensive to the vast majority of the American people. The vast majority of the American people did not want Project 2025 and that extreme agenda and playbook. That is why the president on the campaign trail tried to run away from it and tell people he didn't know anything about it. And extremism that is a threat to our ability to live and thrive in our communities, our ability to create that for our kids or for people that will come after us, and to our country and democracy as a whole. So that is the threat. And the courts are a front line and a extreme and major guardrail right now in stopping what is generationally defining and generationally threatening extremism. We have in federal courts stopped the nationwide funding freeze and essential services freeze that was putting things like Meals on Wheels and Head Start in the balance. We have stopped ICE coming into houses of worship, whether they're Baptist churches or Quaker meetings or Sikh temples, right? The courts have stopped an attempt to write out of our Constitution birthright citizenship, which is written right there in the 14th Amendment. And I could go on and on and on. And yes, over the weekend, our team at Democracy Forward, alongside the amazing team at the American Civil Liberties Union, filed a case at 2 a.m. on Saturday morning to block the president's use of the Alien Enemies Act, which is an act that has only ever been used 3 times in the nation's history: in the War of 1812, in World War I, and in World War II. And of course, in World War II, it led to the internment of Japanese Americans, for which presidents, Congress, and the courts have apologized as a major stain on our values as a nation. And that is what the president has invoked in order to deport people from the country who have had no process at all. And just a few hours ago, late last night, we filed another paper with counts from people's families who are now missing because their family members have had no process. So that's what happened over the weekend. And we're winning a lot. And so the Trump administration doesn't like to exist under the rule of law, because it doesn't want to be constrained by anyone. It doesn't want to be constrained by the people. It doesn't want to be constrained by the courts. And so you're seeing a range of very highly concerning rhetoric and a range of highly concerning conduct by the administration that is seeking to suggest that some courts don't matter as much as other courts, that district court judges may be optional. And you see the courts, I think, being very strong, the judges across the board, judges who have been appointed by Republican presidents, judges who have been appointed by Democratic presidents across the board, speaking out against that and bringing the government into compliance. So I'll just start with that. That's the headline, is that the courts are delivering for us right now, and they're a really important tool. And so I would encourage folks to learn more about that work and to follow it. It's really important for all of us. There are many that are worried about what happens if the Trump administration truly doesn't follow a court order, disregards something that the U.S. Supreme Court rules. You heard the Chief Justice this week have to come out to say that in this country, you actually can impeach judges. And in some instances, judges should be impeached if they're engaging in unethical conduct, if they have, conflicts of interest, or sort of not engaging in good behavior is what how the Constitution calls it. But you don't impeach judges because you don't agree with the decision that they've made, and you can use the appellate process for that. And so the Chief Justice has had to remind the nation of that, given the rhetoric coming out of the administration. In a world where we do approach that point, there are tools that the courts will have tools. The courts have tools to enforce their orders, but it's also going to have to be Congress and people across the country that also mobilize to check at this abuse of power. And I do believe that our country and our Constitution provides all the tools that are needed to check an extreme, king-like, harmful actor. But one branch of government can't do it alone. And so right now we're working in the courts, and you see the courts doing their job. But if we came to a point where this administration was going to ignore the courts, we would of course need the courts and others throughout society to do their job as well.
Now, I want to return to Sarah, speaking of how to push back against the party in power. Such a smooth segue I have here. So ensuring and expanding access to Medicaid has been a major priority of yours since your time in the Delaware State Senate. And Democrats have warned that Medicaid may be on the chopping block to pay for the tax cuts Republicans are hoping to approve in the reconciliation bill. So we've been talking about leverage. We've been talking about what can be done to push back when you're in the minority. So what recourse do Democrats in general have to block these potential cuts and ensure the safety of Medicaid?
Yeah, well, first off, we're not just warning that they may be at risk. It's clear if the Republicans in Congress, in the House, have their way, it is at risk. The Energy and Commerce Committee, in the resolution that was passed a couple of weeks ago, not the continuing resolution. People are very confused by that. Not the continuing resolution, but the resolution that begins the process for the larger reconciliation package requires the Energy and Commerce Committee to cut at least $880 billion from its jurisdiction. At least $880 billion, as much as $1.5 trillion. And there is no way to get to that number without cutting Medicaid or Medicare. And it is probably, we are probably right to believe them that right now, in this exact moment with this reconciliation package, they won't go after Medicare. So that leaves Medicaid, which covers 1 in 4, 1 in 5 Americans. Almost half of kids in this country, nearly half of childbirths in this country are covered under Medicaid. It is a life-saving program. It is a lifeline for children, for people with disabilities, for seniors who need assisted living, and of course for Delawareans and Americans who are low income. And so this is really at the heart of our fight to push back against the reconciliation package, given the wide-scale impact that cutting and gutting Medicaid would have. The reconciliation package, as you know, is a process that does not require a 60-vote threshold in the United States Senate, which means it needs a bare majority in the House and a bare majority in the Senate. And in both chambers, Republicans have more than that. So if this passes, it is entirely because Republicans decide to pass it. But as we have seen in the past, like we saw in 2017 with their effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act, if the public is mobilized enough, if there is enough public outrage and enough public pressure, it can put pressure on the right members of Congress in the right districts to either vote no on the entirety of the package or remove the draconian cuts. So we have been in Delaware here as a congressional delegation, Senator Coons, Senator Blunt Rochester, and I, every single day sounding the alarm about these cuts. My colleagues across the Democratic caucus in their own districts are sounding the alarms. Many are going into the districts of Republicans who are refusing to do town halls to sound the alarm. I believe that we are breaking through in an environment where it is hard to break through. We are breaking through around the issue of the Republican efforts to cut and gut Medicaid. And unfortunately, there have been a number of members of my caucus who have passed away recently. So the threshold for Republicans to defect is higher for us to defeat it in the House. But I do believe there is a path to put pressure on Republicans to stop this. But we know that this is a different political environment than 2017. And if they implement these cuts, if they push a budget that slashes Medicaid funding, it'll have life-threatening and in some cases fatal consequences for my constituents and folks around the country. And it is a budget, it is a proposal, it is a cut that Republicans will have to own. And I believe the public, their outrage, if it doesn't win in the next couple of weeks and months, their outrage will obviously drive people to the polls in November of 2026.
So for my next question, I want to take a step back and acknowledge all three of your roles as trailblazers, honestly, in your respective fields, and ask a more personal question for all of you. The late Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm famously said about being a woman in politics, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring up a folding chair. So what does bringing a folding chair look like for you? And to further torture the metaphor, how important is it to have allies to ensure that there is room at the table for your folding chair? So whichever of you wants to start with that one.
Well,
I'll just make it short. I'll say this is an opportunity for me to self-promote and say Shirley Chisholm was an original founder of our organization when it was NARAL Pro-Choice America. Well, actually, when it was National Abortion Rights Action League and the National Association to Repeal Abortion Laws, its first name. So she was there for that period of time, and we learned a lot. Our leaders have learned a lot from her and her example. Look, I mean, my career, I started, working on the Hill, working as a district director, being a chief of staff, and now here. And look, bringing a folding chair means inserting yourself as much as possible, as aggressively as possible, as confidently as possible into conversations where folks sometimes don't think you should, can, or will be effective. And you have to just demonstrate through sheer grit. And I think all of us on this call and so many folks I'm sure listening have that experience. I mean, most of my career, I'm 52 years old. I was the only in every single place I went. The only Indian American. When I was the chief of staff, there was only one Indian American member of Congress, and I was the only Indian American chief of staff in the entire body, which is wild. And that was in the 2010s. That wasn't that long ago. But when you also are the only, and I know nobody knows this better than Sarah McBride, you have two sets of responsibilities. One, is to the constituency you represent, the work you do, like in my case, Reproductive Freedom for All and our 4 million members. But the other is to be a voice for the voiceless and the communities who you and the leaders whose careers you built your career based on, right? Like I can only be in these rooms because Shirley Chisholm kicked down that door and integrated reproductive rights organizations in the 60s and 70s. So I have that responsibility. No matter how people perceive me, I always will wear that responsibility, whether I want to shed it or not. So that's my quick answer. And I want to really hear from my colleagues, but you just have to be aware that you're wearing lots of hats. You have to be willing to code switch, but you also have to be super confident that you deserve to be there and that your being there is making the work you're doing better.
I'll go next. I mean, many touched on obviously a lot of the dynamics that are at play when you are a first, which means by definition you are the only. I knew when I got elected that there would be some colleagues of mine who would seek to use my service as an opportunity to gain 15 minutes of social media fame. And, you know, every single day I go in, I feel like I'm pulling up a folding chair. Every single day I go in, I feel in some ways, in so many ways, both because of just the unfortunate nature of Congress today, and also because of the added dynamics of being a first, that I'm going in with having to wear armor. And, you know, striking the right balance, to Minnie's point, of not allowing yourself to be abused without any fight, but also recognizing that a lot of the times then when they are trying to poke you, they are doing so to get a rise out of you. You know, there's a scene in 42 about Jackie Robinson where before he signs with the Dodgers, he is in a conversation with the owner of the team, and basically they talk about how when you are a first, you have to have the courage and the strength not always to fight back, because when you are a first, if you respond to a slur with a slur, as they say in the movie, they'll just hear your slur. If you respond to a punch with a punch, they'll say you were the aggressor. And so finding that right balance of standing up for yourself without then making yourself an even bigger target, incentivizing that behavior, and diminishing your capacity to be an effective, in this case, member of Congress or whatever role you are in as a first, that is a sort of case by case, moment by moment, fluid situation where no one's going to get it right. Right? I mean, it is so delicate. No one is going to always get it right. There are going to be instances where someone should lean in more than they do or lean back more than they do. I certainly don't always get it right. And I don't always know what is the right thing to do in the moment. But ultimately, I know that, to Minnie's point, my most fundamental responsibility is to the constituents that I represent. That includes trans folks, but my responsibility is to my constituents that I represent. And I know that the only way that I can guarantee that while I may be a first, I'm not the last, the only way I can fulfill any responsibilities I have to any other community I am a part of is to fulfill that responsibility to be the best, most effective member of Congress I can be for my constituents here in Delaware.
That's a hard thing to follow. And Congresswoman McBride, you have just been such an inspiration to so many of us that are watching you do this day in and day out. It is amazing to be with you both, who are true history makers and women's history makers. You know, leadership, I think, is really, leadership is taking people where they would not perhaps otherwise go themselves. And then values-based leadership is taking people to a really good place that maybe they wouldn't otherwise go themselves. And so I think about pulling up a chair, it's really essential that we pull the chair up to the table, because that table's not going to go where it needs to without people who have the courage to pull up their chair to a table. Where would we be without Shirley Chisholm? Where would we be without these leaders that have come before us and have demanded more and better? And right now there are a lot of tables where there's a lot of people trying to do back of the envelope calculations about, you know, risks and you know, threats and all of these things, because we have people in power at the highest levels of the federal government who are seeking to govern with a playbook of fear to try to get people to not do the thing that we have to do in this moment, which is to find a way to move forward together and to create a better and more vibrant future. And so I think this is like the time to be the people that bring your chair, bring, you know, your folding chair, bring whatever, you know, whatever you've got to that table, because it's not going to go the place we need it to without people that have the courage to come and make room and sit down. And so that's kind of how I view it. And it's amazing to get to be in the company of these folks who of course do that every day.
Skye, as we continue our conversation, I do want to move forward with you. So Democracy Forward has been involved with a number of cases related to preventing the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, from obtaining personal information about federal government employees, about everyday Americans. So why is protecting Americans' privacy so important for safeguarding democracy?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of, we can go back a long time on that, but I'll go back just a little bit of time. What's happening right now is that DOGE and the White House and the executive branch are seeking to obtain information about individual people, all of us, our most sensitive information, people that have, everybody that's got a social security number, got a lot of sensitive information sitting over at the Social Security Administration, people that have exchanged funds. You've got information in various of our financial agencies, and it goes on and on. Healthcare information. That was actually a tactic on a much smaller level. There's nothing that's ever happened like this. And I just want to say that this is not normal. It's not even like quasi normal. This is unprecedented in terms of the threats that we're seeing to individual Americans' individual data. But in the Watergate era, under President Nixon, when you had a president that also toyed with, and I say toyed with because it's nothing, again, compared to what we're seeing now in the White House, but you have a president that was motivated by retribution against certain, political foes or people that they considered political enemies. Congress passed laws to protect the American people, including the Privacy Act, was passed by Congress to prevent the very thing that was happening then on what was, seemingly considered a very concerning and large scale, but compared to what's happening now was sort of like training wheels, right? And so Congress and people across the country have recognized for some time that there is the privacy of our information, the ability to have a trusting relationship with government, where the government is going to have some information in order to be able to deliver services, in order to be able to do what the government does on individual Americans. And that has to be protected. And it has to be protected from a retribution agenda. It has to be protected from oligarchs. It's got to be protected for a lot of it. And you have an administration now that's really running roughshod over those protections. And so we think that's a threat. Sure, it's a threat to our democracy. It's totally in the face of what Congress has protected the American people from, in the face of how the executive branch is supposed to operate. But more importantly, it's a threat to individual people that are living their lives, who are now experiencing either disruptions in services that they receive or in the way the government functions for them, or are concerned about the privacy of their families and their communities. And so we are in court literally every single day to stop that. Yesterday, we got another order from a judge rebuking the Trump administration's attempt to get out of having to provide what we lawyers call discovery, which is where we're going to get to learn more about DOGE and find out more. They've tried to block it several times, and a judge, by the way, that was appointed by President Bush, has continued to give us a very fair look at what we need to learn in order to be able to move these cases forward. So I'll just say that's what we're doing. We do think it's a great threat to people, and there's an opportunity in this moment to use the courts to try to protect the rights of people.
So I have another question for the three of you. I want to tie what we've just been talking about, so privacy, abortion access, even going to the rights of LGBTQ and transgender individuals in particular. Let's pull this into this larger conversation about autonomy. So historically, obtaining personal autonomy has been a major struggle for women. And we've seen a lot of strides, and it seems like we're beginning to see some regression. We're also seeing some trends on social media. So, for example, advocating for a so-called trad life, wherein women advocate for existing under traditional gender roles. So between what's happening at a political level and a cultural level, do any of you have fears about the future of women's autonomy in this country? And how do you sort of ensure that the progress that has been made is not halted?
Well, Grace, I'm obsessed with the trad wife phenomenon, so I'll start. I mean, the core answer is a yes, we are terrified. It is a nightmare. 21 states with extreme abortion bans and restrictions in this country right now. That is 21 states where folks cannot get their basic life-saving health care, and it is outrageous. And where we can get adequate reporting of the outcomes for women's health in those states, we are hearing disastrous stories like my home state of Texas, where the great folks at ProPublica, published multiple stories last year about women dying, right? In Georgia, in Texas, which has led to those states shutting down their maternal health review committees that are public, right? And trying to suppress information. But I think the trad wife, for folks who might not know what we're talking about, Grace and I are talking about, this is this phenomenon of content creators online really romanticizing the idea of homeschooling, which in some cases is necessary, right? Cooking home cooked meals for your family. I love to do those things too. But also, not so subtly, the secondary message is subservience. Subservience to men, subservience to a patriarchal image of what marriage could be. And this is doing an extreme amount of damage. And here's the tangible way. You might say, that's crazy. That's a goofy social media trend. But we know anti-reproductive rights activists are advocates are funding some of these same accounts to push disinformation about the efficacy and safety of things like birth control. And we're actually seeing data that correlates with a rise in these types of accounts and willingness for young women to propagate problematic misinformation like, well, birth control is actually bad for you. It's very much how the anti-vax movement started. It is something we should be incredibly alert to. Our organization, along with many others, are thinking about how we invest in feminist content creators who can tell the other side of the story, and not engage so much in political warfare, but do what our opposition has done really effectively, which is create the cultural conditions for the policies that we know are the most beneficial for the American people. In this case, access to abortion, access to birth control, access to IVF. And how do we seed and support more voices that can talk about how those things were transformative to their lives and are everyday parts of their lives, and not give up in the face of this onslaught of extremist money funding what looks like cute organic content about folks with their sourdough starters. I mean, it seems kind of crazy to even engage in this discussion, but this is the reality. And it means we all have to do much more aggressive work in that content and information space and in the attention economy we're now fighting. And it can't just be political ads and, voter, engagement. We got to go deeper into the culture.
First off, Grace, I think your question, one, sort of perfectly encapsulated the connections in sort of theory and impact of all of these different attacks. And there is no question that right now we are seeing in, I think, modern history, an unprecedented regression politically, legally, and culturally. And I think in order to figure out how to move forward, we have to understand why this is happening, why we are experiencing this. And there's a lot of contributing factors to this sort of cultural regression we're experiencing with gender, but on a whole host of issues, on sort of faith and belief in the concept of liberal democracy, on race and our belief in nurturing and fostering diversity and inclusion. We are seeing a just wholesale cultural regression in this moment. And I mean, some of it is rooted in, I mean, there is something happening in the sense of purpose, the feeling of love that a lot of young men in our society are struggling through right now. And that's not that's not, you know, a theory. We see it in the numbers and the data around deaths of despair among men. And one, we have to recognize that reality, that there is very real pain. And I do think all of us have to do a better job when we see people in pain of not saying, well, you should just be thankful for what you have, right? And that's true across communities, across identities. I think also, you know, I talk to my friends who are teachers, and they're like, you would be shocked the number of young boys in our schools who, when they write essays about who they admire, Andrew Tate is one of the most frequent topics of those essays. I mean, it's just, that's disturbing. And we have to understand where this is coming from. And yes, there are very real issues that we have to address in communities. There have to be examples of positive masculinity for people to emulate rather than just toxic examples. I also think that in this moment, we are living and experiencing the old truism that became a cliche, that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I think what we are experiencing right now is, as a majority of our population, their lives, or at least living memory, exist all after the progress of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We think of history, the knowledge of history, as sort of cumulative, that humanity inherits the knowledge of history of the past. But if you don't have people with living memories of a world prior to that progress, it becomes very easy to forget it. I think one of the reasons why we see a regression in belief in and staunch defense of liberal democracy is because we've lost the greatest generation for the most part. Right? We don't have people in living memory who learn the lessons in their own lives and then are able to testify to us in this moment, right? And there's a generation, there are generations of women now who don't remember a world prior to the modern feminist movement. And I think one of the challenges before us is figuring out how to guarantee that people relearn those lessons. How do we make sure they relearn those lessons before they learn it by experiencing a world that feels abstract to them, that, you know, they think, well, they'll get the vibes of the past, but not the actual tangible impact of not being able to get reproductive health care or not being able to pursue their dreams. How do we figure out how to make sure people learn those lessons without them actually having to experience those lessons? I don't have an answer to that yet.
I would just add to these wonderful insights. I do, just to go back to the initial question, and which I'm glad you asked on during Women's History Month, Grace, you know, around the threats to autonomy. I think we see that, right? I mean, Dobbs certainly was a major milestone in these threats, but they had been there for some time, and they are, you know, there's already such so many more at the state level, and really with this extreme administration's agenda, they are doing things that are not as loud as maybe one might expect on these issues, but they're nevertheless doing things that are super harmful, both a threat to the autonomy of women and of all people, but also a threat to the really well-being of people, including, by the way, the federal government is no longer pursuing its litigation in Idaho that was ensuring that federal protections that have been in place for decades in the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, which entitles everyone in this country to the ability to get emergency care in an emergent situation where it's needed for your health or for your life. And that's now, you know, been deprived, women have been deprived of that if they're pregnant in certain states. And the Biden administration had been pursuing litigation to enforce that federal protection for all of us, which this administration has abandoned. And so I think that these threats are quite real. We also see that at the state levels, of course, in many states. And I know that all of us are committed in the ways we can to engage to try to flip the script on that and build for a better future. But I think the threats are they're quite stark. And anyone that studies the sort of patterns of societies that are in, a democratic backslide, which unfortunately we are at the moment in the United States, knows that attacks on autonomy and reproductive freedom go hand in hand with broader attacks on freedom overall and on democratic societies as a whole.
So we have just under 10 minutes left. I could talk to all three of you for hours, but alas, we all have commitments in life. But I'm going to try to get to some of our audience questions here. So I'm going to sort of combine a question from Pam and from Liz. So this is for Sarah specifically. So does the Democratic Party need new or younger leadership to pull us out of traditional politics? And how do you assuage those Democrats who might be really frustrated with what they see as the absence of leadership, that you are having conversations and are taking their concerns seriously?
Yeah, well, I think on that the latter question there's no question that there are really honest and needed conversations happening within the Democratic Party, certainly in our caucus, about what is the right approach to meeting this moment. And I think, our leader, Hakeem Jeffries, last week, his approach to the continuing resolution was the right one. We have to be strategic about the fights we take, but we have to take on fights and we have to stand firm. And when we have the limited levers at our disposal as minority parties in Congress, when we have those moments to lean in, we need to lean in. And I think House Democrats are united in recognizing the urgency, the stakes, and the need to fight in a hard and smart way. I will say, I think one of the things we also have to understand too is that there are moments where we call the question, there are moments where we fight, and we have to keep the main thing, and we have to make sure in an environment where it's very difficult to break through that we are united in, if not the specific message, what we are leaning in on and what we are focusing in on. We do have to shift public opinion as rapidly as possible. And we have to shift public opinion against this president. And in order to do that, that means that we have to meet those voters who are swayable and swing where they are and bring them along with us too. And I do think that often means engaging in strategies and messaging that isn't always viscerally comforting to ourselves. And, we have to figure out a balance between fighting hard and fighting smart. And I think House Democrats are striking that balance. And many of our colleagues in the Senate are striking that balance. To your point around newer generation, yeah, absolutely. We need to have more young voices at the table. We have to have more young voices with platforms in our politics to, one, meet young voters where they are, a demographic that Democrats are struggling with right now, which feels so weird to say in modern politics, that Democrats struggle with at least many young voters. That is so foreign to our experience of politics over the last 50 years, but that is a reality. And the only way to reach those voters is to make sure that we are engaging in tactics, strategies, and messaging that resonates with them. We need young voters, young leaders to do that. That doesn't mean that there is not a space for more seasoned and experienced leaders. I am a big believer that diversity leads to better messaging, better products, better policies. And so you need all of those voices at the table, but one can't be at the exclusion of the other. And I will say among young women, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, and I'll try to keep that, I know I'm talking a lot, is that people keep saying Donald Trump is, that Democrats are playing by the rules and Donald Trump is not. I'd actually say there are two different sets of rules for Democrats and Republicans. That is a reality. Now, sometimes I do think that Democrats overassume this, how stringent those rules are, and yield their power out of an overcaution around those rules. But there are two different sets of rules. I think politics makes a lot more sense when you understand that so much of the framework of those rules is essentially a replication of misogyny and sexism. That the Republican Party is perceived as men, and the Democratic Party is perceived as women. Even when people in those parties are of different genders, the standards those parties are sort of held to reflect the standards that men and women in society are held to. It's why the Republican Party can be angry and yell, and they're seen as strong, and why when the Democratic Party gets angry and yells, it is perceived as hysterical or shrill, or any of the stereotypes that are associated when women get passionate. And I think that women in the Democratic Party, as political leaders and just as women in society, have had to figure out how to successfully navigate the world as women, and engaging in that sort of sexism and engaging in that sexist and misogynistic standards in workplaces in particular that women often have to engage with. And they figure out how to push back, how to fight, how to work, and how to have their message not only break through, but be received by the audience as it's intended to be received, not as others might try to paint it as. And so I think that women in the Democratic Party have a unique perspective to bring in figuring out how to both break through, but also have our message be heard as we want it to be heard, and have it be heard in an effective way, because they've learned how to navigate this world as a woman and how to navigate it successfully.
Sarah, I have to say, I don't think anyone would ever complain that you were talking too much, at least certainly not on this panel.
Can I just say, just put Sarah in charge of everything. She's so damn smart.
I just want to get a lightning quick question to Skye. It seemed that a lot of our audience members had questions about the courts, and specifically looking at the rights of migrant detainees. So I was wondering if you could just very quickly talk about when looking at these cases where legal residents of the US are being detained, what can be done to protect the rights of the people who are being detained?
You know, that's why we're in court every single day, and that's why our partners are in court every single day. And I just want to give voice to, we do a high volume of litigation across a range of issues, but this is not new. What the president is doing is unprecedented. It's a threat actually to all people in this country, every single person, because what he is doing is saying that without any process, you can be removed from the country. And I think we've got to understand that that's where we are, and that's what is happening. And we have not seen that before. We've never seen this type of power used outside of a declared war. And even in those circumstances, which of course in World War II led to one of the greatest stains on US history. But even in those circumstances, there have been some guardrails that this president is not even abiding by right now, which is why we were in court with the ACLU on these issues, and why we're in court every single day on a range of other issues. I will also say that there are just tremendous people, and it's very humbling to reflect on it, but like tremendous people who day in and day out are working on behalf of migrants and immigrants and people who have either been, falsely accused of some type of violation of our immigration laws, people who are trying to seek asylum because of circumstances in their country of origin, and getting the opportunity to really see up close what so many lawyers for the immigration community do day in and day out without fanfare, without headlines, has been an honor and just an honor and a highlight of my career, and of a range of the folks that are in court now. And these higher profile cases are really, those cases are built. The building blocks of so much of that are people that have done this day in and day out. But we are at a real crisis point. And the main thing is to enforce the legal process. And then, of course, if we could ever get our, Congress to do more, that would be great too. But there are a number of rights that people have, that immigrants have, that people who are lawfully here have, that are being violated by this administration, that the courts, I think will enforce. And that is what the work is right now.
All right. Unfortunately, that is our time. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Congresswoman Sarah McBride had to hop off, but we are very grateful to her for her time. And thank you to Minnie, thank you, Skye, for really being here for such a diverse conversation. And it's been really a delight to talk to you. And thank you to our audience members as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Grace.